Hi everyone, it's Peter Schiff. This is Wednesday, March 24th, 2010, and I am recording this from my Newport Beach office. I wanted to talk today about a number of things, but unfortunately I only have time to talk about one on this video blog, and that is going to be health care. We know that the Obama bill was passed the other day and signed into law, and I obviously oppose this for a number of reasons. One of which is that it's not going to work. It's going to drive the cost of health care much, much higher. Remember, the reason that costs are running out of control is because the tax code has encouraged the excess utilization of insurance. People are paying for health care with insurance that they should be paying for out of pocket. A lot of routine medical procedures that we used to pay for ourselves because of the tax code, we now shift those costs to insurance. And of course, the excess utilization of insurance and the third-party payers and the extra costs that this puts in the system is the principal reason that costs are going out of control. The fact that the government is now going to add 32 million more Americans into the insurance system is going to put further upward pressure on costs, and they're just going to go up even higher than before. The fact that the government is trying to claim that this is going to reduce healthcare costs is an outright fraud. It's the same type of lies that they made when they got Medicare passed in the 1960s. By 1990, the program cost over 10 times, adjusted for inflation, what it was exposed to cost. And of course, it's gone up a factor of 5 since then. We've got $30 trillion of unfunded liabilities. The program is a complete disaster. And now they're trying to expand it into an even wider scope, and it's going to be an even bigger disaster. You know, just one example of the inherent fraud behind the government assumptions used to pretend that this is going to reduce the deficit. One of the assumptions that they make is because this plan is going to reduce healthcare costs for companies that now provide it, that those companies are going to take those savings and increase the pay to all their workers. Everybody's going to get a raise because companies are going to save so much money. And the government is already counting the extra Social Security taxes that it's going to collect based on these raises that they have no real proof are actually going to materialize. But to really see the fraud behind these assumptions, this bill also requires a lot of companies that now don't provide any insurance to their workers to start providing it, and if they don't provide it, they're going to have to pay a fine. Now, the government doesn't assume that those companies are going to reduce the pay of their workers to make up for the fact that now they're giving them insurance and that they need to give them lower wages to offset for the higher cost. You see, it's heads they win, tails we lose. They can't have the same assumption both ways. If they're going to assume that employers passed on the savings to their workers in the form of higher pay, they have to also assume that they pass on the costs of insurance to their workers in the form of lower pay. But what I really wanted to talk about today is the constitutionality of the bill, and not why it's unconstitutional. I think I've already focused on prior video blogs just why this whole thing is unconstitutional. But I want to point out an article I read in Bloomberg today talking about these lawsuits, that there's going to be 14 states are seeking to challenge the constitutionality of this law. And according to this Bloomberg article, they say that those lawsuits have little chance of success because of the, quote, broad powers granted to Congress by the U.S. Constitution. Now, this is according to scholars. Well, obviously, these scholars are not that scholarly. They don't know anything about the Constitution. They haven't even bothered to read the very basic information, such as the Federalist Papers, to even understand the Constitution. The Constitution does not give broad powers to the federal government. In fact, it's the exact opposite. The powers given to the federal government in the Constitution are very few and defined. They're very limited. Now, you don't have to take my word for it. Let's take the word of James Madison. For those of you who don't know, James Madison is considered the father of the U.S. Constitution. Now, he's the father of the Constitution because he wrote it. Right? Now, the person who wrote the Constitution obviously has a better idea of what it means than these scholars 250 years later. Now, here's what Madison wrote in the Federalist Paper number 45. And if you don't know, the reason that the Federalist Papers were written was to try to persuade the states to ratify the Constitution. And one of the reasons that the states were reluctant to ratify the Constitution is because they were afraid of giving the federal government too much power. And one of the things that Madison wanted to assure the colonists was that wasn't the case. And here is what Madison wrote in Federalist Paper 45. Quote, "The powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined, and will be principally exercised on external objects, such as war, peace, negotiations, and foreign affairs. Federal tax collectors will be principally on the seacoast, and not very numerous." Here's some more quotes from Madison. "The powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite." You know, there are lots of quotes here. Here's another quote, Madison. "If Congress can do whatever it is in their discretion can be done by money and will promote the general welfare, the government is no longer a limited one, possessing unlimited powers, but an indefinite one, subject to particular exceptions." There are all sorts of quotes from Madison, other founding fathers such as Thomas Jefferson, that refer to federal powers as limited, as few, as defined. In fact, the entire 10th Amendment is specifically states that the powers not given to the federal government specifically in the Constitution are reserved to the people or the states. So it's the states that have broad powers. The federal government has very limited powers. And another thing that this particular Bloomberg article points out to try to show that the federal government has broad powers is it points to a case in 2004, I think, where the Supreme Court used the Commerce Clause to uphold a federal ban on marijuana. And they said, well, see, if the Commerce Clause is so broad, then, you know, then the health care is constitutional. The problem is the Commerce Clause is not broad. The fact is that the Supreme Court is ignoring the true meaning of the Commerce Clause. What the Interstate Commerce Clause says is that Congress can regulate interstate commerce. That's commerce among the states. So with respect to marijuana, what would be constitutional would be if the federal government wanted to make it illegal for marijuana to be sold across state lines. That would be legitimate. But what over time, how the Supreme Court has basically broadened the limited powers illegally of the federal government is they have said, well, not only can government regulate interstate commerce, but we can regulate all the companies engaged in interstate commerce. Well, that's not even true. But with respect to marijuana, they're not even regulating that. Let's say I'm in Connecticut and I want to grow marijuana in my backyard and smoke it, right? There's no commerce there, right? By regulating that, they're not even regulating commerce. So now the Supreme Court is saying that because the federal government has the right to regulate interstate commerce, they have the right to regulate all Americans, whatever they want to do in their personal lives through any kind of behavior, which is obviously not the case. You know, there is no constitutional authority in the Commerce Clause or anywhere else for the government to make marijuana illegal. The states can do it. If the state of Connecticut wants to make it illegal to grow marijuana in your backyard, and then they can do it. But the federal government can't do it, and they can't use the Commerce Clause to do it. The fact that they're doing it doesn't mean that the Constitution gives broad powers to Congress. It simply means that the Supreme Court is failing us, and it is not enforcing the Constitution. The reason the Constitution was written was specifically to limit the powers of the federal government, and if the federal government outstepped the narrow bounds of the Constitution, the job is for the Supreme Court to strike those laws down. Now, just because they've done such a lousy job in the future doesn't mean that they should do a lousy job again with respect to health care. But, you know, if this Bloomberg article is right, if the Constitution now does give broad powers to the federal government, then I think, you know, I don't think its ratification is even valid. I think it should be torn up and we should go back to the Articles of Confederation, because there's no way that anybody would have ratified that document if it gave the government broad powers. It was only because the federal government had powers that were strictly limited by a constitution that it was ratified by the states in the first place. And the fact that these scholars, you know, are so unknowledgeable in the Constitution is beyond belief, and is not even relevant to this discussion. Anyway, I wanted to talk more about it, but again, I am running out of time on this 10-minute video. So take care, everybody. Bye-bye.